And we are back. Welcome to Abstractable. I'm Ryan, and with me is Lockie. The Abstractable Podcast is for curious people who want to learn, and we dig into some of our favourite thinkers and uncover what to take away from their ideas. Today's episode, we talk about Daring Greatly by Brené Brown.
This is a great book, and in this episode, we discuss, some of her ideas, which revolve around vulnerability and shame, and these deep-seated emotions and kind of what they mean for your life, how they plague ourselves and society, and why we spend our lives pushing away others and actually ourselves. And we kind of parlay that into what she talks about the disengagement divide within organisations and how it applies to work as well. So why are we reading this book and talking about it? Well, it's the kind of concepts that will allow us to lean more into what Brené calls a wholehearted life. And it helps to start unravel some of the toxic feelings that hold us back from doing what we really want to. So if you want to find out more about Brené Brown, she's an absolute superstar. So you'll find her on Twitter with her millions of followers at Brené Brown, or she's got a fantastic blog and a really detailed website at brenebrown.com. We hope you really enjoy this episode. And we're back. How's it going, Ryan?
I am going really well. And how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Good. It's about 7:30 at night here. What time is it where you are?
20 past 11, mate. Is there ever a time that we're not going to say we're doing well?
Probably not. It's just not a great way to start a podcast.
The Aussie way.
Yeah, exactly. What are we discussing today?
Daring Greatly by Brené Brown, Dr. Brené Brown.
Yeah, this is a great book. I really enjoyed this.
We're entering into some new territory here today, mate. I don't think we've hit on a book that kind of tackles something that's in territory, certainly for us, that is harder to venture into from time to time. So, I want to dare greatly today in this episode. Excuse the pun.
There he is. So, give us a quick overview of what this book's actually about, and then we'll dive into the bio.
So, Dr. Brené Brown, she's essentially a researcher. She's had an academic background, but she does lots of other things too. And so the body of her work is centered around human emotion, vulnerability, and shame, and these particular ideas and how they manifest themselves out into the world and the way in which we structure ourselves and organizations in society. And she touches on some what almost sound like non-intuitive ways of looking at these particular emotions, particularly when you first hear about them. And I'm sure we'll get into that, but just these things that we maybe perceive as being weak, certainly from definitely from a more male perspective in that regard, which are in fact the opposite of that. And they're actually signs of strength. And so that is kind of what she hits on throughout this book and explains about, things like perfectionism and why, that is such a terrible thing, or why shame is such a terrible thing, and how we need to eliminate it more, not just from a personal feel-good perspective, but also from a productivity perspective, or from a making more of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I think I'd challenge you slightly on the eliminate word. I think she'd probably say recognize and deal with the shame, as opposed to, because something that when I was reading this book, I think often when I'm kind of challenged with this sort of type of, I suppose, concepts, is I think, this is about someone else. This, I'm reading this about someone else. It doesn't really relate to me. But that's just a total straight up defense mechanism. And when you lean into it a little bit, and when I read this, I tried to be really conscious of the fact that, this happens to everyone, including myself, and to kind of recognize that. And it is scary, I think.
Yeah, I think when I say eliminate, I mean, we are never going to eliminate that internally, but I think eliminate it from the paradigms that probably exist, and just the kind of shame culture that exists is probably the thing that she's probably trying to, push away as much as possible.
Bring it out into the light, yeah.
Turn it to the light side.
That's it. Don't turn to the dark side. So Brené was born Cassandra Brené Brown in 1965, and she's from Texas. She's definitely identifies strongly as a Texan, and it's in a lot of her speeches and that sort of stuff. She's brought up Catholic when she was younger. And then
she has no
left.
shame in being a Texan, mate.
That's right. Loud and proud. And then she actually left the church for a couple of decades, but has then since gone back to some sort of Christian faith, which she talks about loosely in her writing. But effectively, when she finished school, she started her work. Probably the start of her career and the start of her work as an academic was studying social work at the University of Texas, which she finished in 1995, and then she followed it up with a master's in social work in 96. And in that time, she married her husband, Steve Alley, who she's still with today. And he actually kind of features in, part of her writing is really she exposes her vulnerability and talks about portions of her life with her family, and Steve's a big part of that. She spent probably post that really the best part of the new millennium, the last 2 decades, studying the topics, as you said, of courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And along the way, she started writing a blog and is a prolific author, really, because she's written really a number of books throughout that time. So she said the first one was I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't, Telling the Truth About Perfectionism, Inadequacy and Power in 2007. The Gifts of Imperfection, Letting Go of Who We Think We Should Be and Embracing Who We Are. That was 2010. I've read that and I thought that was really good. This book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to Be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent and Lead, 2012. And then since then, Rising Strong, The Reckoning, The Rumble, The Revolution, Braving the Wilderness, The Quest for True Belonging, and the last one, Dare to Lead, in 2018. And 5 of those books have been New York Times #1 bestsellers. So absolute superstar. And I know a lot of people who are, fanatical followers of her, and she's made a difference in so many lives through her writing and the concepts that she puts out. So in 2016, the Huffington Foundation, they honoured Brown by pledging $2 million over 4 years to fund the Brené Brown Endowed Chair in the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. And that's where she's a research professor, and she holds that chair effectively that is named after her. Effectively, she lives in Houston, Texas with Steve, and they have 2 children, Ellen and Charlie. And in March 2013, she launched this book on Super Soul Sunday with Oprah. And the book title comes from a Theodore Roosevelt quote, "Citizen in a Republic." So I guess she kind of launched it on a really massive platform and, it kind of took off. But she really became famous from a particular TED Talk she did that really catapulted her through. And she actually talks about the process of going out and doing that TED Talk and how it felt. It was the thing that really changed her life, but it felt so scary to do, and she felt a lot of regret afterwards. And but, she was exposed to that vulnerability and now she's a superstar.
I love how she, because she did the first TED Talk, and that was kind of her presentation, her initial kind of exposure to the world. This is the research I've been doing. And in that, she looks like she knows exactly what she's talking about. She's got a very well prepared presentation, et cetera, et cetera. The presentation itself went viral, blew up on, TED Talks and YouTube and everything else, and ended up, really kind of shoving her into stardom. And then it's quite interesting her coming back, in a number of years afterwards and actually doing a TED Talk, almost analyzing herself in that TED Talk as the example, because she said
about the TED Talk.
Yeah, about the TED Talk itself, and just how exposed she felt when she did it, and how much she regretted, getting up on stage in the first place after she first, saw that the video had posted, and then when she saw that the views had started skyrocketing, she, was becoming even more scared. She was like even more concerned about the exposure that was happening. So interesting.
Wow, it's so interesting. It is. Oh, that's our catchphrase, I think. So interesting. We roll that out every time.
That's probably the abstractable meme. Very interesting. Yeah. Interesting.
That's the first T-shirt when we release the merch. So, do you see parallels with Steven Pressfield's book and this book?
There's certainly parallels because it's about leaning in some form. But I would suggest that where Steven Pressfield comes from is a internal resistance related to a creative outlet. Whereas I think vulnerability and shame is related more to connection with others. In the way that Brené is describing it. So, but certainly in both instances, I think they're really about showing up and being there. You're there on the coalface. When you recognise that, in Pressfield's case, it's resistance, or in Brown's case, it's this shame or not wanting to be vulnerable. Actually kind of leaning into that feeling and giving it a good punch in the gut and moving on. So there's definitely parallels, but I would not connect them up completely. What about you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I kind of feel like that this is the deeper emotional reason for the resistance that Pressfield talks about, and that this is the underlying both scientific and also, psychological connection to yourself that kind of leads to the issues that Pressfield talks about. And his scope is narrow. It's about creativity. But I think creativity, being creative, and I know Brené Brown talks about this in her book, is a high vulnerability exercise. It's an exposure. So to me, there's a lot of crossover, but not direct, but there is these concepts linked together in the web, I think.
Yeah, I think they're both tapping on this. There's some sort of thing that's a barrier to, and so in her case, the barrier is really centered around something that's extrinsically maybe focused, where it's, reliant on the connection with others or the perception of others. Whereas in Pressfield's case, certainly the perception of others is something at play that he talks about in the book, but the resistance is definitely something that manifests internally, and it's about dealing with it internally. It's like dealing with the internal critic as opposed to the external critic to some degree.
Tell me about vulnerability, because that's there's two massive parts to this book, vulnerability and shame, I think.
Yeah, well, she sets the book out. She's like, So we're going to tackle vulnerability and shame in this book. And she's like, whoa, I know, like, that's a big ask, but we're going to do it. She's like bracing you in for this journey. And it's quite interesting because she does hit on both. And I think they're quite, the way that she describes them both, they're very connected, very much connected things.
It's really interesting how she kind of talks about during her research, she was like hoping for different answers. So it'd like validate some of her personal things that she was avoiding, feelings or dealing with feelings of shame or vulnerability. And she was almost feeling, I don't know, I guess I can use the word, the resistance at that point, not to dive into these things because she kind of felt she knew that if she found out that that was true, she would have to then change the way she went about things, which was very scary.
So vulnerability, she says, sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they are never weakness. And so she says that vulnerability is like being naked on stage and hoping for applause rather than laughter. That's us at the moment, mate.
Yeah, it is.
And
it is kind of daunting to record your opinions, particularly being someone myself who has always had a bit of trouble with that. And then also, getting that kind of connection to vulnerability is not something I've been particularly good at, and a skill that you've kind of got to build up over time, I think.
So we're gonna try this episode, hey, to lean into a little bit more of that vulnerability, hey.
Absolutely.
Get stuck into it. And so she says that vulnerability is life's great dare, and I think this is where you have some of those real parallels coming in about Pressfield's work, and it's kind of like that great dare that you need to go at. You have the courage to kind of put yourself out there and be seen in some ways. So, we spend our lives pushing away and protecting ourselves from feeling vulnerable or from being perceived as being too emotional, which is what I spoke about earlier. We feel contempt when others are less capable or willing to mask feelings, suck it up and soldier on. So, we've come to the point where rather than respecting and appreciating the courage and daring behind vulnerability, we let our fear and discomfort become judgment and criticism. So she says then that our willingness to own and engage with our own vulnerability determines the depth of our courage and the clarity of our purpose. The level to which we protect ourselves from being vulnerable is a measure of our fear and disconnection.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm going
to create a rule. We need to create a rule every time we say it's interesting. There's a punishment.
It's a fun. Yeah, it's a drinking game for the listeners.
Talk about deflection. So we're not going to take the hit. Straight onto the listeners. So it's almost an incentive for us to say it more.
All right, well, why don't we say this? What's a figure that we will donate to a charity every time we say it's interesting? You want to put $1 in each?
I think that's fair.
All right.
I reckon that's a good idea.
Who's going to count it?
Shit. Someone will. Someone will just create a loop video of our episodes and get the tally up.
That's it. Well, someone out there can let us know on Instagram what we're up to, and we'll put it we'll put it somewhere to a good cause. So I'll kick it off. It's interesting that that's $1 from you, $1 from me. To me, that's something that came up with this. It was sort of around, people show you their highlights reel. Never has that been more the case than at the moment where you've got a camera and the filters and all that crap, something that everyone talks about. But, this is
talking about Instagram here.
I'm talking about life.
Yeah.
So even now, how are you? You said at the start of this. I'm great, you know. How are you? Fantastic. Or you meet that person, and depending what the status thing is in your conversation, like if it's at work, they're like, oh, I'm so busy, you know. And that's kind of their way of saying I'm busy because I'm important or what have you. And it's not about oversharing, but it's like people are trying to put on, everyone, including me, you, everyone, put on that highlights reel, you know. And so what she says in the book is that we're actually looking for others to be vulnerable, but for us not to be, because we understand that when we see that in someone else, it creates connection. But we won't do it ourselves, you know. And I think that's a big thing, you know, is that, and you can see in the way she communicates, and one of the reasons why she's so you can connect with her writing is that she really opens up, you know, but not to the point where it's like uncomfortable for you, you know. I think she talks about that as well.
Well, one of the big things she says is the important thing about vulnerability is that you are sharing with people that have earned the right to hear that vulnerability. It's not about broadcasting out every single nook and cranny of your life, your deepest, darkest demons and skeletons in the closet, and broadcasting them out into the entire world, because she says that is specifically not vulnerability. That's just broadcasting. That's just, you know, being on show. That's the same thing as running around with these highlights, this highlight reel on, because there's probably a different motivation in there. It's about that feeling of, you know, I imagine typically certainly in like a one-on-one situation where, you know, you feel that there might be that moment where you go, am I going to share this? And then instead of choosing to just move on into the next conversation or skip over it, you kind of lean in there and go, no, I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to say that here. I'm going to be vulnerable here. And that's where she says, have the courage to be vulnerable in that situation. Because she actually, that's definitely one thing she points out is it's about there's like this reciprocal nature to it.
Yeah, and she talks about that a bit later in the book where it's about work as well. I was going to say the other side then, because it sounds scary and it's like, well, what happens? And from the work that she's done, she says it's the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity, and it gives greater clarity and purpose to our lives. That's some pretty bold statements there, mate. It is, and it's not. I think there's a little. I know for me, it's not something you can just switch on. It's like it's a muscle to grow, isn't it? Like to kind of recognize it in yourself. Are you actually even being honest with yourself? Right? That's not that easy. And this is something that as I've read this book, I've started to learn a lot about this, and it's a journey to continue to go on, and even having this conversation is going to help understanding what she's talking about, I think. Because I'm certainly not coming to this from a point of having mastered it, that's for sure.
Oh, it sounds like, you know, if anyone's to be, you know, maybe to have been a master of this, it's probably Brené Brown, right? And she still says that she's going on this journey every single day. Every single day for her is a journey into this vulnerability, and this is like her life's work, is studying vulnerability and shame and some of these other, you know, deep-seated emotions. So I think it's a continual thing that we continue to do.
Is there anything? Go on.
And so I think, I think the key thing that we touched on there is it just grows over time and requires work, requires attention, and kind of full engagement with it. She says it's like growing a marble collection.
That's so random.
Did you ever play marbles? Because I think no, neither did I. I think she's in a different age bracket to us.
Yeah, it's not something that got rolled around. I mean, yo-yos were a thing. That was pretty cool.
Did she have a yo-yo collection?
No, just one. But you know, there was a big yo-yo phase in primary school. Huge.
So how is that a relatable analogy?
Well, it's a kind of a kid's game, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think she's talking about like getting a better
marble
collection.
Connection.
Well, what about Pokemon card collection? That's something we did.
Yeah. Till
they got banned.
They got banned.
Yeah.
It's happening in Bendigo.
Yeah, I think they banned all the sources of fun, mate.
What about Tamagotchi? Were you too young for that?
Yeah, but again, I don't know if you collected those. Although a few people used to kick around with like Tamagotchi on a keychain. You used to have these keychains and you'd have like 3 or 4 of them. I never quite understood that.
Why would you collect marbles?
I was still jealous.
You still wanted it anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So any kind of personal reflections for you on how you felt when you were reading this portion around the vulnerability stuff?
Yeah, like every bit. But aside from every bit, there was one that really stood out was she said that research tells us we judge people in areas that we are vulnerable to shame. And I think that's something that I'm definitely susceptible to. Yeah, and it's something that's very hard to stop. I think that's a very innate thing, which is why she's obviously
really
picked it up in research. Yeah, and so
what's in it? Like, can you give an example?
Well, mate, my OCD tendencies to do things in a particular way just scream at me from time to time when I might see someone doing something in a way that's, you know, maybe not as precise as it needs to be or as efficient as it needs to be. And I don't mean that
mostly when dealing with me.
Mostly dealing with you trying to set up your fucking microphone.
Yeah, or posting in Slack in a random order. I know that really kills you every time.
So that must be where I'm most vulnerable.
It's on there, it's good enough.
That must be where I'm most vulnerable to the shame.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's a really interesting concept that I think is super relevant.
Is there any kickers for you there, mate?
I think the kickers for me came a bit further on, to be honest. Probably more around the shame section, I think. It was where I kind of probably recognised a bit more what was happening with me. But certainly, I mean, okay, so we've had a slight technical issue.
So talking about twigging on my OCD judgments and things.
Don't
really
shame me here.
Hit it on the head there, Lockie.
Don't shame me here. This week it was my computer memory was full because there's crap everywhere on my computer, which would make Ryan have a heart attack. So
there's no shame, mate.
But we haven't.
I'll put it aside.
Thank you.
I've moved on.
I appreciate it. So talking about shame, this is probably the other key point of the book, right? Is that she kind of introduces vulnerability and then she talks about the way that shame is a blocker that stops us, I suppose, exploring vulnerability. And, you know, it was interesting that she explained her journey into researching this, that she really started out interviewing women around shame and felt that was probably where it was most acute between the sexes. And then she had an encounter with a man at one of her talks who encouraged her in very strong language to, you know, look into that in men as well. And when she did, she was kind of shocked with what she found. And And now she feels that it's kind of equally felt between men and women, but it's felt in different ways. And effectively, kind of her definition this is paraphrasing her, but it kind of revolves around the feeling of not being normal when compared to a societal norm. And she, in very broad categories, and this may not be your experience personally, but on average, or if you want to use that word, if there is an average, she
you don't
says
need
that,
to tiptoe, mate. Just get
oh,
into
look, I think it's important that you kind of, I think particularly with masculinity and femininity, you don't have to be a man to feel some of the stuff she's talking about now. Or you don't need to be a woman to. I think that can induce shame, right? If you don't.
Yeah.
If it's actually interesting that you bring that up, because like this is like the archetype that she's talking about. And you could actually feel shame about not feeling shame in the way you should. It goes that deep.
A psychopath.
So she says that men, they can basically never be weak, that shame causes shutting down or anger to happen in men more broadly, and in women there's the pressure to be beautiful or be good at everything but make it look effortless at the same time, and these are patterns that she saw came through. And then when women feel shame, they're more likely through her research to criticise others and kind of lash out in that way. And so I think that.
And what about men? What do?
Well, they either just shut down and become a rock, which is probably the mode that I go into, or they lash out in anger, and really explosive.
In physical anger, explosive anger.
Yeah, maybe not physical violence necessarily. That is one of them, but also just anger and being super angry and emotive and threatening, and so it affects people in very, very strong ways, and it's a blocker to exploring the vulnerability.
Do you feel the weakness? Do you feel that weakness is something that triggers you, right?
I think it's yes, I do. I think that feeling like maybe not physically strong is one, but more like weakness around. There's multiple ways that you can be weak, or be seen to be weak, and it's maybe not taking on a particularly daunting task or, being afraid to have that tough conversation. I think that I feel that kind of pang of shame, like I should be able to deal with this a lot.
Yeah. That's the thing to emphasize here, is that the weakness thing isn't just, related to physicality, and just the same as in the case of the female, it's not, it's not the aesthetic beauty, in isolation. It's like an overall image thing, and so how does something perceived, or how does it look? So in the case of weakness, I reckon a classic one that's thrown around, certainly going back to construction or even growing up, is, are you up to it? Do you reckon you're up to it, or do you reckon you're up for it? And like that comment there is it's like a perpetuation of that very shaming culture, which is quite interesting, because it hits on, a way to make a guy do something is to go, you up for it, mate? Or do you reckon you can handle it? Or do you reckon you're up for it? And because as soon as you do that, it triggers the weakness thing. The ego comes over and jumps in and says, yeah, I've got this. Absolutely got this.
Yeah. I think it took me a long time, particularly in a work setting, to even be able to say, look, I don't know. And when I kind of got that through that, it was very empowering, because I kind of saw a lot of people I respected doing it. And I was like, maybe I don't need to have everything figured, you know?
Well, mate, you've progressed a lot further than many if you're at that stage, because we'll talk about it shortly, but one of the dated paradigms is about that, leaders always need to know everything. Leaders need to, and certainly in running a business or running a team or managing a team, like, to not have the answers is okay.
Yeah, I tend to agree. So Brené talks about this, what she calls shame resilience. And so this is all part of her idea of a way to live what she calls a wholehearted life. And the 4 key elements of that are recognizing that it's happening to you, which is, again, something that, I've had to work on to kind of see that in myself. Assessing expectations. So, like, what is the kind of expectation I'm trying to live up to here that is causing me to feel this way? Reaching out to someone trusted and giving it a voice. I'm feeling this way. And she really talks about that once it's she kind of relates this to Harry Potter, actually, but that is a lot of that work, that writing is around shame, she feels. And that if you kind of give it a voice, if you say Voldemort's name or whatever, it diminishes its power. So putting it out into the light is a way that she talks about really being able to kind of see that perhaps it's not as scary as you thought, because a lot of the feelings that come up through this, her research has said that it's mostly about fear of what others will think.
That's quite interesting. Bang, there's $1.
He costing me.
I'm bringing myself down at the same time. the he who must not be named, right? The shame that must not be named. In one of her, I think it's in her second TED talk, she actually talks about almost like explicitly naming it. And, she did this study on people who say a particular phrase, and it's a phrase that's like an entry into a conversation. It's like, when you do that particular thing, or this is the way that I'm, the way that I'm seeing this, or the way that I'm hearing this, or the way that I'm understanding this, one of those type of phrases when you're approaching someone about something shameful is that this is how I interpret it. And so you're kind of calling out that particular shaming thing somewhat directly by saying those phrases, and then going on to talk about that particular thing with someone else. And she says that that's a really great way to kind of break into enabling conversations to happen around shame or around vulnerability with other people. Having some of these like lead-in words which really help break the ice.
Yeah, kind of your language is important. She says, shame resilience is about finding a middle path, an option that allows us to stay engaged and to find the emotional courage we need to respond in a way that aligns with our values. Is there anything that resonated with you around the feelings of shame or how that blocks you?
The big one here is the process that she outlines, which is it's almost like a 4-step process. Sure, that's great. But I think the hardest part in any of these situations, the same goes for dealing with biases or, some of our automated heuristics or things that we need to unlearn, for example, is it's about that initial awareness and recognition. And I think that can be the hardest part, is simply just not seeing it at all. There are many things that we don't see that go on internally. And I think one of the best things that I've done, one of the biggest contributors to helping see some of this stuff go on is meditation, without a doubt. A regular practice of meditation, just because it can sometimes buy you a little bit more space, or give you a little bit more, give you like a slight step back from time to time in being able to see some of these things crop up. And for anyone that hasn't delved into meditation, that can sound quite woo-woo. It can sound quite abstract, but it's
getting pretty mainstream now, which is a good thing.
But I think there's still plenty of people that haven't actually tried it, or don't get why it's such a thing, or just think it's just a stress reliever or something like that. I think there's a lot more to it than just that. In fact, I don't think it. Research has shown.
What's that?
I said, so research has shown it. I don't think it. Research has shown it.
Yeah, that's it. It's it's a thing. Get on board.
So we mentioned the institution before, which is some of the dated paradigms that have come to play, and Lockie, you're sitting in a bracket, I think, that would be more of a minority across the board. I think in that situation where you're actually comfortable with saying I don't know, because my firsthand experience is that's not something that's a very rare thing to hear someone in a high position say, certainly in more hierarchical organizations.
Yeah, it's not something that comes easily and all the time, and a lot of the time I still, bullshit like the rest of us. But I think I've gotten a lot further down the path of saying, look, I'm not sure, let's find out, and people appreciate it, even though it's pretty scary.
Yeah, and I think I like the second bit that you introduced there, because I have heard this whole, people say I don't know, but it's a very dismissive, I don't know, like move on, who cares? And I don't think that's necessarily constructive either. I think that's also a bad trait. But anyway, she talks about, when shame, this idea of shaming becomes a management style, engagement within organizations change. And basically what it does is, because if there's a shame culture that's been driven, where it's bad to not have the answers, where if you make a mistake, that's, it's seen as being such a terrible, terrible thing. What happens is we disable the ability to learn and create and innovate within organizations.
This is a huge one from Creativity Inc., which is one of our later episodes, that they put a lot of effort at Pixar into not quashing an idea or giving everyone. It's not that there's no bad ideas, but you don't get kind of talked down to if your idea isn't that good. It's an open culture with a lot of trust.
Yeah, and another example of that is, and it's quite an old one, and many people have heard of it, but just Google's 20% time or whatever it is, or one day a week where you get to do whatever it is the hell you want to do, whatever project you want to work on. And that's a real empowering way to empower those to go about tinkering and making a mistake and trying something. And, if nothing comes of it, that so be it. But something may come of it. Eventually it may not come of it, initially. And there's been many, many examples of that, of either complete new innovations within companies or completely new companies spun out of some of these things that have happened, and huge successes along the way.
Yeah, I think that the best leaders know to ask good questions. Like, if I just reflect on the people I've enjoyed working with the most, is that, I remember being on one tender in a giant meeting, and the leader just basically was just saying, you need to explain this to me really simply. I don't understand, going through it and being the one that no one else dared to be. Kind of reminds me of there's a movie called Margin Call, which is a great movie. And Jeremy Irons, Margin Call. And it's basically, you should watch it. It's basically based around like
a movie or a documentary?
It's a movie, and it's about at the end of 2008, basically one of the stockbrokers figures out late at night that the whole company's at risk of falling over when the market opens tomorrow because of their crazy trades. Anyway, stuff happens. Then they fly in the big head executive, and he choppers in, and just as they go into the room, they say, whatever you do, don't lie to him, And what he asks in the room is that there's a whole, full boardroom of people, and he says to the quant guy, explain this issue to me, but tell it to me as if I was a golden retriever. Like, I'm not smart enough to understand this, so you just tell it to me in the simplest terms possible. And in that, he immediately shows his authority by not being scared to admit his weakness. It's an interesting concept, and it's not about power, but it kind of has that. It's leadership, I guess, isn't it? Although he's a pretty horrible guy, so let's not take it to that example. If you've watched the movie, you realise this guy's not that nice, but it's kind of a Hollywood version of that kind of style, I guess.
So what you're saying, Lockie, is model off him, but don't model off him.
Absolutely.
I like it.
Don't be him. Yeah, it's a great movie. You should definitely watch it after this episode. After we stop recording,
there's a double take on this.
We both said it's interesting just then.
Yeah.
So
mate, I'm gonna be broke after this one episode. Hopefully we stop soon. Fingers crossed. There's a double take there because he might be just doing that from a power play position too, because to be able to actually explain something simply, it's a smart position, not necessarily a power play, but to be able to explain something simply, you need to understand it, to its absolute depth. Like there's the throwaway. If you can't explain it in 30 seconds, you don't know it. Or if you can't, Richard Feynman's idea around, I think he's famous for saying, you need to be able to educate this to a 12-year-old. And so he's been able to distill down some of the, some crazy theoretical physics ideas and, quantum theory and stuff and explain it to 12-year-olds. And that's a real showing of, mastership, and that you've worked out your way around, what it is that you're talking about.
Indeed.
So the other thing she says, it's it's really crept in this whole, Viking or victim. And you did mention Wall Street then. And I think, Wall Street definitely has that name of, the win or lose, we crush or we get crushed type mentality. And she basically, that definitely encourages this shaming culture. So the question I've got is probably how, because at the end of the day, there is some commercial realities, obviously to running a business. And so finding the balance between the reality that, there is sharks out there in the wide open world versus, internally we don't want that culture that permeates that. So, we are a fish sitting in the ocean as an organization, and there's plenty of sharks kicking around, but how do we keep everything internally running, without the focus on that, without the dog eat dog, scariness.
Yeah, something like law is kind of a zero-sum game, which is why I guess you pay your barrister so much. So it's a win or lose outcome, I assume anyway. That's why you pay them so much. But so in that, it's particularly difficult because it is combative. But I guess there's like, as a group, not that many things are that kind of zero sum, I don't think, unless you set them up that way. Particularly if you're an organisation, you can grow. Like if people don't have to clamber over each other to get a leg up. There is, but it's not a group hug either, right? Like you kind of you need feedback, like Ray Dalio kind of talks of. But it's about doing it with empathy. It's not about pretending everyone's great and we all get a medal. It's about being empathetic, that it doesn't mean that you're a bad person or what have you if you need to work on something. So,
yeah.
It's about not it's pretending you're not invincible, I think.
Yeah, that's a nice little
or not
a nice little way to bring some accountability. Yeah. I think that's maybe a good way to think about bringing in a little bit of that accountability that's driven from that being in the ocean.
Because she talks of normalizing is a hugely powerful thing if you're in a leadership position, and if someone stuffs something up or something, you telling them about a time that you did too makes them feel human. And it also means that because without a doubt that leader is going to make mistakes, and as much as they try to cover it up at some point in time, it will be found out about their mistake, and people learn. They learn from not what you say, but from what is done and what you do and how you act. And so this is where she talks about this idea of the disengagement divide, and that the shame that permeates because people are shaming particular ways of doing things, or if you make mistakes or whatever. But then you have this on the other side. You as the leader are you are making mistakes and you're just kind of shuffling them to the side or not having them preached out. And so you aren't being reprimanded, but everyone else is. You end up with this divide. Yeah. There's actually a book that you just reminded me of that I've got on my reading list called Einstein's Mistakes. I think it's just a book about all the things he stuffed up. So
there's also Einstein's biggest blunder, I think, which is another one I think that talks about exactly probably that even these people like Einstein makes mistakes all the time.
Not anymore.
Yeah, the only way out of making mistakes is if you're not here.
Yeah. So there's an interesting thing you've kind of got here around tag that I'm intrigued by. I want to know more about. Is this one of your principles?
This was so this is something that kind of cropped up for me when I was thinking about this idea. Now it's not wholly related, but I think there's inklings of it here. So the idea is the tag is the accessibility gateway, and the way I look at it is, you might be listening to an incredible musician, for example. Let's say a jazz musician, and the likes of, say, Miles Davis or John Coltrane or something, right? And you might have you might have gone along with a friend to a concert with these guys, right? And you've got no idea what you're walking into. You've listened to a couple of jazz tracks in your time. Nothing too serious, but you might have listened to some of the commercial things, right? You know that there's a few horns that play and a few drums and whatever. So your friend takes you there, and you sit down, and you've got kind of no idea what you're kind of coming into. You're expecting some of the stuff you've heard on maybe the radio or whatever, and then they open up and just launch into this like real esoteric, quirky jazz thing that's going on, and it's just pure improvisation, and it almost sounds like obscure sounds to you. You're like, this isn't music. What's going on? What the hell's happening here? And then so the first 5 to 10 minutes, they're just jamming away playing this stuff, and you're kind of looking around. Everyone's getting into it except for you, and you just think that everyone here has just lost their minds. And you're kind of looking at your friend; they're getting into it, and then what happens is you go, "Well, that was weird." After they finish their jam and in between songs, and then you go, "Well, I'm pretty well." Disconnected from whatever's going on here at the moment now. So I've lost all interest. And what happens? Next song they launch into, they play something that's a little, much more, relatable. Something that that you've heard on the radio, like a classic track that you've heard on the radio, and they launch into this track, and it's all normal for the first, say the first 5 minutes. And then they kind of gradually launch into this like deep improv solo, and then pull their way back out and back into the kind of the mainstream. And you go, oh, that stuff that we heard before was kind of connected in with this particular song. I get it. And this is the very short version, because it probably has to happen many times, but you've also given the guys a big credibility tick, because that was the best rendition of that particular song that you've ever heard, and you never thought it could be played that way. So they've kind of gained this credibility tick from what they do, and now you've kind of been opened up to a different perspective and way of seeing these things. And so for me, taking that analogy into this disengagement divide space is about aligning the organizational vision, what the actual organization's where they're trying to head to, and allowing people to see, what that actually looks like, and see that these things that we're doing on the surface actually equate, and you can see a direct line through it. It gives people the accessibility to that way of thinking. It's a pretty disjointed analogy, but I think it applies to an organization just as much as it would to, say, a creative pursuit or learning something new.
So it's kind of about allowing people something they can relate to before you get them to dive in deeper, or seeing the connection.
Yeah, it's like, so it's, we might not. And this is just a classic thing of change. We're not going to jar the entire organization by, everyone comes in the following Monday and see that we've now gone from all having our own desks to, no one's even heard about this coming, and everyone now no longer has a desk. We're all on hot spotting, and we've decided that we no longer have paper in the office either. That's a pretty big overhaul to happen straight away, and it's just come from nowhere, as opposed to trickling in these things and making them align to the vision. And then the way in which the leaders are acting, the top of the chain's acting, is the same as what is actually expected of everyone else, or is being said to be expected of everyone else.
I like it. Tag. I'm going to use it.
Tag it up.
It's catchy.
It's like tag, you're it. I'm taking, and you got to chase me. You got to chase me into the jazz improv solo.
That's awesome. I wish I could have seen some of those guys play. It would be awesome.
So do I.
So So she says to lead effectively, use vulnerability to overcome shame in your team. Then this will bring out the vulnerability in them. It's a nice summary.
Yeah. I think
lead with it.
Because you're acting on it. You're acting on it. Yeah.
It's leadership, right? In its simplest term, I think. It's really nice. I love that sentence. It's easy to say, harder to achieve. So something to aspire to.
It's like all those good throwaways, mate.
Yeah. So lastly, before we get into what we'll try and change, one concept that really stuck with me is that Brené talks about the idea that there's this scarcity culture that we kind of live in, that where, we feel that there's not enough, whether it's consumerism or just the way you look or feel or this sort of thing. And that often it's talked about as abundance is kind of the other side of that. I know some meditations and that sort of thing, that's a word that's thrown around. But she says that kind of it's a bit like hate isn't the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. It's like, okay, scarcity, the opposite's not abundance. The opposite is enough, is having this feeling of I'm enough, or I have enough, or my situation is enough. And that's something that I thought was really nice, because it's a really kind of succinct word and it's not really used too much. So it's got a bit of, I guess you can pin a new idea to it a little bit, and the feeling
But hang on, Lockie. Me as a avid personal developer and someone that just wants to grow, I don't want to just get to enough. Surely I want to go more than that. How do I deal with that?
It's about enough in the moment, I think, is what she's trying to communicate. So I'm enough now, but I care about myself, so I'm going to get better, and that mindset is a great mindset. And that's all you need right now, is to know that you're going to keep going, because it's like if you're going on, you want to go to the gym every day for 2 hours and you'd miss it one day and you go, oh, fuck it, I'm done. Well, that's not really a kind enough sort of posture for yourself. You need to don't throw it all out. You're trying, that's enough, and you're going to try again tomorrow. And so I think she talks around this feeling of kind of trying to find a place where you're kind of kind to yourself. Talking to yourself like you would speak to a close friend is something that she talks about a lot, and that it brings down your armor when you do that. So give yourself a break. We're a harsh critic. The internal voice is pretty harsh, I think, for all of us. So, and this kind of idea of scarcity is all through our society. But let's, if you can kind of switch that conversation, it could be pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, well, it ties back to that earlier thing that we said around that you judge others where you feel most shamed, right? And by you leaning into, whatever this is, these particular areas, particularly those that clearly you judge others, which is where you obviously feel most shame, by you saying, I am enough in this particular situation, related to that area. So, by how well Lockie sets up his microphone every single recording session, means that some of that shame will dissipate, not just about others, but also about yourself. And so you kind of settling the chaos that surrounds it in doing that.
Yeah. For whatever reason, it's just the part that really stuck with me, and I'm going to use that. That's probably my one thing, is to focus on the concept of enough and to use her 4 steps to overcome the shame and recognize the shame and share it with someone close to kind of give it that light. What about you, mate? I think you've got a kind of different perspective on what you'll probably change because of this book, or different focus.
we've threaded it a little bit throughout the whole episode, but I think perfectionism is something that she harps on, and it's definitely something that I've had for a long, long time. And she says that perfectionism is not self-improvement. Perfectionism at its core is about trying to earn approval. Most perfectionists grew up, being praised for achievement, and it becomes a debilitating belief system. It's I am what I accomplish and how well I accomplish it. Please perform perfectly is what she says. And so she says that perfectionism is a hustle. It's not a healthy striving towards improvement, for example. And there's a great little quote from Voltaire in the book. It says, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." And so that'll be one space for me, mate, is leaning into not judging you on your Slack comments as harshly.
Thank you.
Going into the future.
That's okay. I know I'm enough. So we thought we'd close with the Theodore Roosevelt quote that does kind of cap both ends of this book.
Yeah. Do you want to do the honors, mate, or
I'll let you.
You'll me to do it. Yeah. So this is, and I'm sure many people have heard of the man in the arena, but it's so fitting. So it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, but comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly. Fantastic. And aside from the fact I fucked all that up, that's a fantastic quote.
Nah, well said. It's awesome. That was fun.
Definitely no Theodore Roosevelt, mate.
No, you did good. Catch you next time.
See you, mate.